Here is Scribo Verde Bosco, a green ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
As a green, this isn't my green, but it is still a great green. It has tone variation by pen and does shade very well. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, I found it's less impressive to look at most of the time. While it isn't really for me, I can say it is generally an interesting ink to use that certainly doesn't look like anything that would come from a rollerball. So while this isn't an ink I'm running to, it's certainly not an ink I'm running away from. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry. A Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet. A Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M805.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the lightest tone that we're going to get, a very nice kind of refreshing sort of green with no feather, no spread. It does shade in such places as such on the first line, where you see that H at the end is much darker than the rest of the word. Where folk right next to that, the downstroke of that F got quite a bit darker. It lightened up through the O, nice mid-tone with the L, and the K at the end, very dark. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, not hordes, but it does. Take a look at horde on the first line where the H is very dark, lightens up quite a bit into the O, very dark at that A again, nice mid-tone R, and the D at the end, darkening just a little bit more. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade about as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. Now, if you take a look at before on the first line, the E, the first E, is lighter than the rest of the words, mostly a dark word, but underneath that is mostly a lighter word, where that D becomes much darker with lighter letters all surrounding it. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, just a little bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade about as well as it did with the soft fine. Take a look at Worm of Dread on the first line, where the W goes from a lighter to a dark tone, stays dark into that O during the O, lightens up a little bit for the RM at the end. Of is uniformly a light tone. Now, dread starts darker with the D, stays dark until the A, where it gets to be a lighter tone, keeps that into the beginning of the D. The downstroke of that D does darken up a bit. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There were approximately 9 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, though not as well as it does on the Clairfontaine, but definitely shading. Take a look at heart compares to looks, second and third line. You see a huge difference from one word to the other. Now, there doesn't seem to be a ton of shading in individual words, though it is there. Mostly what I'm seeing is tone variation from one word to the other. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does not shade. It just goes down as a very dark, and I think like this right here is its best. that's just for me. If this is the notebook I'm using all the time, then I am very willing to use a lot of this ink with this pen. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it still doesn't shade, it still puts a great tone on the page. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it doesn't shade. I probably shouldn't be writing with this with a broad because it just does not look as good from a broad as it did from the, I'm going to say, finer nibs, meaning medium and under. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, obviously showing that this is a little translucent of an ink being affected by the tone of the paper. Now it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. If you take a look at melody on the first line, you can see that me at the beginning is a little lighter than the L that got quite a bit darker. The OD lighten up some. During that downstroke of the D and into the Y, it gets much darker. Looking at the wet fine nib, it's a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather on haste, both of them on the first line, on friend on the second line, now on the third line, so it's feathering some. And it's spreading just a little bit. It's not shading. I don't think the feather, the spread, or anything that would stop someone from using it on this paper, but it is there. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. Little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, actually lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, not even just a little bit. It does feather about like it did with the wet fine. You can see it on Caverns, old here at the, it's feathering in pretty much each word a tiny bit, but it's there. Most minimal amount of spread, but it is also got that spread present. The shading at this point I'm a little unconcerned with because it's more the amount of feathering and spreading that's going on that would draw my attention. I think the feathering is more noticeable here than it was with the wet fine, which is certainly not a good thing. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine, which is making no sense to me. It does have tiny bits of feather, really tiny feathers, and I'm not sure how well they're going to come through on camera, but I see them with dark and on tall on the first line. I see it with of dread on the second line. I see dead, comma, and with the feathers on the third line. It's pretty present. So is the spread. It also still looks the least appealing to me with that broad in how it's coming down on the page. Looking at the page underneath, we see that it did bleed through in a couple of spots. I circled them to make them easier to find, and it happened on the medium, not the wet when you would think it would with that wet fine. You see on the back of the page, the ink did get quite deep into the paper with the broad and the medium. Not nearly as bad with the wet fine, still very deep into the page. No problems with the soft fine, so whether you can write on the back of the page would come down to which nib you were using. And it did only spot the pages underneath, but that's kind of a problem.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as the Clairfontaine. It does stand out against this quad rule without any kind of a problem, allowing that to melt into the background, leaving what you write as the most important thing on the paper, not the printing of the paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade less than it did on the Clairfontaine. Really hard to spot some shading areas here, only the occasional lighter letter. For the most part, I would actually call this not shading. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It does shade a little better than it did with the wet fine here, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but you can really see some tone variation when you look at like they sounded on the third line, where you see huge difference from one word to the other. And sounded starts very dark with the S, lightens a little bit with the O-U-N and the beginning of the D. The downstroke of that D to the ED at the end, quite a bit darker. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It almost has nothing for shading. I mean, you can spot a couple of points where, sure, it does, but it's not the best. I will say also, I see a little reaction going on where it crosses the print of the page. Really look at the on the second line, right in the middle. You see it get kind of weird there. It's drawn my attention to it at the crossing of the line. It has me looking at other areas like the G of marching on the third line. So it's not reacting really well with the quad rule that is printed on the paper. Looking at the back of the page, there is no bleeding, there is no ghosting, so no problems here.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Organic Studios Willow Green. Here is Papier Plume Forest Green. Here is Pelican Jade.
Here is Pinonia Silient Nettle. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, I think, better than it did on the Clairfontaine. Take a look at Elven King on the first line, where the EL are a little bit darker than the VE. The NK darkened quite a bit. The ing at the end is a bit lighter, except that downstroke of the G, and lake underneath it, the LA is lighter than the KE that end. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, no shading, and it might pass. It might pass if your teacher did not like green ink to be used. You might get away with slipping this one by because it is very dark, at least in person. I'm hoping the green comes a little better on camera. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. Shocking how this is doing with this. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade. Take a look at face on the second line, where the F, that downstroke, very dark, lightens up into the A and the beginning of the C, very dark into that E at the end. Y underneath it, very dark, but that H is, while it's very dark, just a hint lighter, showing some of this shading there. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. It's got a couple light seasoning spots, couple dark spots. I wouldn't really call it shading so much. The thing I will say is that no matter what, this absolutely stands out against the quad rule, so it has that going for it no matter what. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Monteverde Fire Opal. Here is Pilot Yamabudo or Crimson Glory Vine. Here is Noodler's Dark Matter. Here is Diamine Poppy Red.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. There's a couple moments of shading. It is passable here. I think this is usable. So with that, I think this is a good ink on this paper. I'm not a big fan of what I'm seeing, but I don't think it's the worst of what I've seen, so I would use it if this is what came across my desk. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread. I think the feathering is less noticeable here than it is in the soft fine. Strange, I know, but this looks better than it did there. Much more usable, much better combination to me. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it does not shade. It is a decent green on the page. Decent and just decent. Certainly not something I'm going to go for. The feathering and the spread are something that you probably could handle most of the time. I wouldn't not for this medium. No, sorry. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather the least. It does spread the least. It does not shade at all. I actually think this is the best of what we've got on this paper with this ink. Best match.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine gives this kind of soft minty light green that shades well, and the wet fine is the darkest along with the medium. Both the wet fine and the medium shade well, and the shading stands out, I think, the best with them. The broad is only slightly darker than the soft fine. It shades about as much as the soft fine and just often makes me feel a bit disappointed looking at it. So I would say I think the best bet here is with a medium to wet flow fine or medium pen.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.